Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Sakey speaking. Haven't you been wondering why this word or term, Indigenous peoples, is being touted around everywhere? We have Indigenous biodiversity, Indigenous for Agenda 2030, Indigenous buildings, Indigenous people, Indigenous declarations, Indigenous councils, and it goes on and on and on. So many groups across the world who are natives to their own country call themselves Indigenous, and many arrive there first don't call themselves Indigenous. So not all natives of different countries actually call themselves Indigenous. In fact, some were so angry at the UN when they went to the UN for a speech by the Indigenous World Council, were that annoyed that they had not given their permission to be called Indigenous and didn't know anything about it, they actually had a protest and walked out of the UN. There was a couple of hundred of them, I believe. So the term Indigenous people has been globalized, a one label for all native peoples, a huge diverse range of native peoples. So the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it was first brought into the UN, established in the UN officially in 2007, 13th September. Well, New Zealand government was under Labour then, and Rosemary Banks was in the UN Assembly to speak on New Zealand's behalf as she rejected the UN agreement. She rejected it because it meant that it was actually non-compliant with New Zealand law, our constitution. It meant there would be two classes of citizens and that Indigenous people would own the entire land of New Zealand, even though it was many parts of the land has been legally in ownership of other people. They could still own it. And the other thing was that there was redress as compensation for the land that they had lost, and that meant the entire country of New Zealand, veto rights over law, control of the resources in New Zealand, the natural resources. It wasn't compliant with the Treaty o Waitangi. There were several reasons. In fact, it came under four provisions that New Zealand felt did not cover all of New Zealand's citizens, not good for all New Zealand citizens. That was the principle of governing New Zealand. So Article 26, Article 28, compensation, Article 19 and 32, the right of veto over other people, the state. Article 26 stated that Indigenous people had the right to own, use, develop, control lands and territories that they've traditionally owned, occupied or used before. So this meant the entire country of New Zealand was caught up in the scope of Article 26. So it also required the recognition of rights to lands lawfully owned by other citizens. So that was non-compliant, and it implied that Indigenous people have the rights that other people do not have. Article 28, the entire country would fall again under this scope of redress, which is compensation for all the lands in New Zealand. So it implied Indigenous people have a right of veto over democratic legislation and over natural resource consent. Well, you see that going on now with Indigenous biodiversity, where they have the right to go onto your private land. It covers private land and also public land. So the UNDRIP is incompatible with the democratic process, legislation, and constitutional arrangements of New Zealand. And it means there'll be two classes of citizenship. The veto rights were awarded to Indigenous people and not others. Others don't have the same right. It doesn't recognise the general principles of New Zealand law, the states, and the UN Declaration. They said at the time, those that signed it, 4 countries didn't sign it, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and US. But the other countries that signed it, many of them said it was a document of aspiration, that they didn't believe it would have a legal effect. So the term Indigenous is now used majorly right across the world. It's grown. You have Indigenous people, Agenda 2030, Indigenous biodiversity, better Indigenous policies, the constitutional Kariro, that's Indigenous, that is the replacement constitution for the constitutional arrangements in New Zealand that was discussed with overseas visitors in November last year. To replace the New Zealand Constitution with this Kariro Constitution. So Nānea Mahuta opened the second day of that meeting and spoke about this. The public are not actually brought into the equation at all. So we're talking about National Iwi Chair Forum plus the Human Rights Commission set about developing New Zealand's action plan to implement the UNDRIP in New Zealand in 2019. This was paused, postponed. They still had workshop. They did a draft, and it's just sitting there to continue with. It's not finished. So there's external, international, internal oversight pressure for the government to implement the UNDRIP by the UN. So the UNDRP has reference of being contravened as a constitutional agreement naming Treaty o Waitangi and the UNDRIP rights of Indigenous peoples, combining the two. When you look at this, collaborating the two, well, the original Maori 1840 Treaty o Waitangi, it didn't create a partnership. It didn't create principles. That was done in the 1980s by legislation and judicial. They're the ones that created that, not the original treaty founding document. So Treaty o Waitangi has been corrupted. So you may well ask, well, how did that terminology of Indigenous people come about? Where did it originate from? Well, it originated from Tanzania, and it was introduced by a man named Paringa o Pakapene. He was a Maasai tribesman. He was a radical activist, a major member. He was a former member of the Tanzanian government parliament. He travelled around US and met up with Navajo Nation, the Indians in Southwest America. He was invited to stay with them for a short time, which he did. And while he was there, he introduced them to the term of Indigenous peoples. So he was quite onto it. He pushed his agenda, this Indigenous people, far and wide. He was outspoken and propelled his radical activism. He also became linked with international circles of other tribal nations, Mexico, Canada, etc., to sharpen their understanding of Indigenous peoples. He applied himself with the international workshops for Indigenous affairs. This was established in Copenhagen. He later visited Geneva, but by the time he got there, he'd done so much groundwork in pushing this Indigenous people, it had already intensified. thus serving as a partition distinguishing that of white settlers and non-European owned lands. So by the time 1960s, 1970s came around, there were liberation movements were starting to flourish. In New Zealand, it was the Polynesian Panthers that worked with Ngā Tamatoa to rally for Indigenous Maori rights. Then in the US, they had the Red Power, the American Indian Movement, and the International Indian Treaty Council, all inspired by promoting, pushing decolonization, the decolonization of everything. So non-Westernization. So Indigenous people became a term that became globalized. Paakapuni has successfully remodeled the old Latin noun known as indigene, which was originally formed by combining indu, meaning in or within, with the verb gigene, meaning to beget. To beget is to bring a child into existence by the process of reproduction. It is also a reference to procreate, generate offspring, to cause, produce as an effect. The definition is too difficult to describe for the UN because they say they have no legal description of Indigenous peoples, the term Indigenous peoples. So what they've concluded was these people who want to call themselves Indigenous, they can do that by self-determination. So this is Indigenous people became one global identity for a various group of different tribes, natives, right across the world, very diverse. Today, there's over 500 million people. They claim they're Indigenous people. Being first, but doesn't mean necessarily they are first. And those that are first doesn't mean they are Indigenous. So a handful of Gaelic monks, for instance, there were Vikings then too, were the first to arrive in Iceland, yet Icelanders are counted as being Indigenous people by the UN. Then you have the Scandinavians, the ancestry going back to the Siberian reindeer herders, yet Scandinavians are listed in the UN Indigenous book as Indigenous people, but they come from Siberia. So there was a meeting at the UN Assembly when a mixed race of Afrikaans and pastoralists read a speech at the UN Forum about Indigenous affairs. Hundreds of delegates walked out of there in protest because they said they did not identify as Indigenous and they had never been asked consent if they wanted to be called Indigenous. Then you've got all this reimagining, restorytelling, the romanticizing of this idyllic, historic past of Maori warriors, warriors from this place, warriors from that. So romantic, the forest people, the people who just looked after the water, the stewards of the air, the forest. But nothing is said about what really went on until Westerners came along, colonization, with the missionaries, with lawful people to bring in laws to stop the tribes killing each other. It's all been romanticized. So Maori scholar Evan Porter Smith wrote about the pressure to adopt identities that are naturalistic and unchanging, saying if you fail to follow this path, you risk being looked at as inauthentic. The ideology of establishing a one world identity of Indigenous people for a widely diverse array of peoples includes that of widely aggressively promoting decolonization as a social revolution. So one of our, when you look at this and you think of the oppression around this, the race baiting, the racial type health system that the government have brought in, the control of the natural resources in New Zealand when you see Indigenous. This is an oppressive way of doing things. This is an oppressive society. So oppression, nobody wins in oppression. Everyone loses, everyone becomes a victim. Globalised, regionalised, nationalised identity politics, legislated to cause civil unrest in nation states. It's a political globalised agenda. It's all about globalism. This hurts all people. It's a human rights tyranny. So people in Australia, New Zealand, North America even sent petitions to British royalty. One of these was T.W. Ratana, who appealed to the League of Nations in 1923 and 1924, but he didn't mention Indigenous people because that came later with Papapini. George Manuel was the president of the Canadian Indian Brotherhood. He also was the president of the International UN Council of Indigenous People. Now, he also was an activist who travelled around the world preaching this entrenched term Indigenous people as an identity in 1971. He came to New Zealand, he went to Australia after New Zealand. When he came to New Zealand, he was with a Canadian delegation, and he was taken from one place to another to get to know the Maori people. In his hotel room, he invited Maori politicians into his hotel room with certain Maori entertainers, and he spoke to them seriously about this Indigenous peoples term, to indoctrinate them, to get them to use it, and it was taken very seriously. Hence, it was adopted in New Zealand way before the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. So Manuel was fluent in the politics of Canada, First Nations. He was interviewed by a Yukon newspaper called the White Horse Daily, and he spoke about Indigenous people, saying, we want to maintain our status, our special status, our rights. And he said they were fighting a white Commonwealth nation for land, a worldwide movement for cultural autonomy, and the rights of Native people, Aboriginal rights. From New Zealand, Manuel then travelled to Australia, and he talked with an assembly of Aboriginal students and told them to be proud they were dark, and they have every reason to be even prouder than the white man. October 1975, Manuel's dream materialised. As the stage was set, delegates from 19 countries then founded the World Council of Indigenous People, and that's when he was elected to be president. The World Council and the UN Working Group of Indigenous Population was founded in 1982, and there was a promise of drafting an international law. In the UN 2021, a report on the state of the world's Indigenous people referred to the status of Indigenous people remains a subject of contention. So going back to Tanzanian, Papapini, the original Tanzanian voice for Indigenous people, he appeared in Geneva. He was a Maasai, wore emblems of primitive Africa with spears, shields, stretched earlobes. When they went to the UN, him and his delegation, they were also wearing sunglasses and fancy watches. So journalists and those who were part of making documentaries told them to take these sunglasses off and these watches. They were to look as tribal as possible, and that they did. So they had pictures of them on magazines and documentaries all over the place. So you had a Hindu rights propaganda website in 2020 where a columnist observed, in the game of woke, We Hindu actually hold all possible cards. We're a people of colour. We came from Indigenous culture that is different from organised religions. How we cannot go wrong, we can't. We will just keep winning every argument. So the United Nations and International Labour Organization have embraced the term Indigenous people. But the term Indigenous can also trap communities. It's supposed to liberate into a globalist eco-incarnation because it's all about oppression, identity politics, oppression, victimization. So the globalist agenda, Indigenous peoples being used to expand, promote the UN One World globalist agenda, NGOs, politicians, academics, environmental activists, UN, WEF, and all their cohorts that collaborate with them globally, regionally, and nationally. Namely, Indigenous sovereignty mirrors two classes of citizenship and one nation. Civil unrest, the hastening, the journey to destroy nation states. The enemy. Nation states are the enemy of globalization. Destroy nation states. A one world governance for all. Professors, academics in Harvard refer to Indigenous world buildings, Indigenous land to transform food sovereignty worldwide. FAO, Food Agriculture Organization, UN. They also report biodiversity, internal Indigenous food systems, sustainable UN Agenda 2030 to leave everyone behind. So leave no one behind, everyone at every age. The Indigenous iwi elite voice, they are speaking for our people. Who are our people that they call our people, the Indigenous people? Do they have the consent from all those people who they say are our people? Those that identify as Indigenous, do all Maori people, those with Maori blood, Maori descendants, call themselves Indigenous? I don't think so. I think I'm of the opinion it's about self-interest of the iwi elite. They're conforming, collaborating with the UNWEF, the puppets in Parliament of the global agenda, and the local government with a biodiversity, Indigenous agenda. So you have Indigenous UN Agenda 2030, and iwi elite in New Zealand are promoting this. Wake up, New Zealand.